Hey everybody, it's Professor Parish. So we're already to poetry. Can you believe it? This presentation is going to go over our first part of our poetry unit, which is chapters 12 through 15. Part 2, which is also going to be in your syllabus, handouts, and videos section, is going to go over chapters 16 through 22. And I know that seems like a lot of chapters in a very short time. The thing about the poetry section, as you'll also see with the drama section, is that these sections are primarily examples, example poems, and not as much terminology. I mean, there are a couple chapters that have a lot of terminology in them, but most of them are example poems, and we'll go through some of those examples. Your discussion forums will require you to read some of those examples, etc., etc. So don't freak out if you think that I'm going through a lot at once. There are some of these chapters in poetry that have no terms, and we'll talk about that. But hopefully these videos have been helpful for you on the fiction section, and I know this class is going by really fast, but I hope it's gone well. And here is my dog, Gypsy. She's gonna kind of be in there sometimes. But so yeah, let's dive into poetry. Usually everyone's favorite genre of literature, right? Usually not. When I teach this class face-to-face, a lot of students, they dread poetry. In fact, some of them even hate it. And I can understand that from a certain point of view because poetry is hard. It is difficult and complex and can be abstract and have multiple meanings, and sometimes there is no one meaning the author intends. And for some people, that's really hard to understand. They're like, well, no, it has to have a purpose. And sometimes poetry is left abstract for that reason. They want audiences to draw their own interpretations, and that can be hard for some readers because they want something concrete. So I can understand if you're not a poetry fan, but hopefully after these presentations and after this unit, you'll at least appreciate it more, even if you're still not a fan of poetry. And then some people are the exact opposite. Some students I have, they love poetry, they love writing it, it's therapeutic, and that's awesome too. So if you're a poetry fan, kudos, and if not, hopefully this unit will let you at least appreciate it a little more and have some fun with it, right? So we're going to start off. You'll notice in your books that when we left off with fiction or with prose, we stopped at chapter 8. We finished chapter 8 and that was it. Chapter 9 in our textbook is just about Flannery O'Connor, which awesome author, but not somebody that we're really going to touch on in this unit. And then if I go to chapter 10, it talks about critical perspectives, and chapter 11 is other voices. So they really just touch on different authors and specific stories. So if you are a fan of prose and you want to kind of scroll through chapter 11 especially, just to kind of see what authors they talk about, that would be great. But we're not really going to have time to touch on it in this class. So we are going to go to chapter 12. Which starts on page 611. And my dogs are down here on the floor playing, so if you hear barking, it's them. Chapter 11, or chapter 12 rather, starts off in our textbook with this picture of Michael Jordan on page 611, shooting a basketball. How fitting. And some of you may be thinking, how is that fitting? And I say, well, one, because it's March Madness. So it's awesome that we get a basketball tie-in at this point. But two, because I grew up in the 90s and was a huge Michael Jordan fan and loved the Chicago Bulls. So that's kind of a little biased. But I think there's a reason they chose a picture of Michael Jordan shooting a basketball shooting a basketball as a symbolic representation of poetry. And I would ask you to think for a second, why would that be? Why would this poetry unit that's talking about fiction choose Michael Jordan as their representation? So why would that be? Why would we choose that? Why choose Michael Jordan as the face, quote, of poetry? And my answer to that question would be basically how they define poetry on the very next page, on page 612. In that very first paragraph, if you guys look at it, it says that poetry is essentially language at its best. I mean, when we look at fiction that is published, there is a lot of fiction out there that is very good. But you can find stories that are published at Barnes & Noble that are maybe not the, highest caliber, I'm going to say, which doesn't make them not enjoyable, but fiction has a wide range. Some authors use a lot of elaborate vocabulary in their writing. Some are very simplistic. There's a lot of range there and a lot of kind of gradients on quality. Poetry, though, when it's published, it is supposed to be the best that it can be. The authors of the poets that choose their words, they have to choose the best ones that will fit their message and meaning. They have to emotionally connect to their audience. They have to try to represent the mood. There's a lot of little nuances that poetry has to kind of check off that sometimes fiction doesn't necessarily have to, if that makes sense. So I think it's fitting that they choose a picture of Michael Jordan shooting a basketball as a representation of, Michael Jordan was the best at his game. Poetry is kind of the best of literature. So I like that kind of touch they put in our textbook here. And as you can see, my dogs are having a field day back here. So I'm sorry for that. If you hear me getting onto them, that's all right. All right, so poetry is different in other genres of literature in comparison for several reasons. The three that they list in our textbook are as follows. One is it comes from a place of confusion, comes from experience. There's a lot of emotions involved with poetry. A lot of poets are writing about subject matter that is very intimate and oftentimes something that typically you wouldn't write about, but poetry is their way of expressing that. So there's a weird flow that kind of usually is involved with poetry, or at least poetry that connects to people. It doesn't just give data or facts. Poetry is not about solid, concrete information. It's about emotions. It's about expression. And yes, there is nature poetry out there. We'll touch on that. But for the most part, poetry is about capturing a moment or a mood about an idea or a situation. And it doesn't necessarily have to have a plot or characters or a climax or closure. It can just be like a snapshot of just that moment in time and what it represents. And I think that's what makes poetry beautiful, but also very complex and sometimes hard for readers to kind of decipher or pick apart. And finally, it's printed as lines of verse. It is not in the form of a typical textbook or a story. It has a very distinct style and form, and we'll get more into that later. But that's really how you can kind of decipher poetry from other genres of literature. So, terminology in chapter 12. This is our preview chapter. So, starting on page 617 and going on throughout the rest of the chapter, we start talking about these terms. The first two kind of go together. We have epic and lyric. An epic, when I think of that, I think of Beowulf. An epic is a long poem created with elevated style. I don't know how many of you ever read Beowulf in high school. My high school teacher was a big medieval literature fan, and Beowulf was something we had to read. I'm personally not a Beowulf fan, but I know some people that just love it. It is actually a poem. I know some of you that have read it may be thinking, really? It doesn't rhyme. But the reality is that Beowulf in English is actually translated. In its original language, and its older English variant, it actually did rhyme. And then when we translate it into modern English, it doesn't anymore. So that's why it doesn't quite seem like a poem. But it is. It's an epic. It's a long story-like poem. The poetry that's in The Hobbit, and we'll talk about that later, would be considered epic, long, sweeping poems that have story-like elements. And you can compare that to a lyric, which is the exact opposite. Lyric are pretty much our songs on the radio now. They are short poems that have various words and moods and situations described, but that's the difference. Epics are huge and long, story-like. Lyrics are very short and concise. An extended metaphor is another term that we'll talk about. It's a comparison that extends throughout the poem. So it's something that keeps coming back throughout the poem, a comparison that keeps reoccurring. And then rhyme, I think anybody that has heard the term poetry automatically connects it with the term rhyme. And that is just an echo effect produced when a poet repeats the same sounds at the end of the final syllables in words. Although not all poems rhyme, and we'll talk about that in this presentation and in part 2. And finally, a stanza. which we can see the poem on page 625 is just a set of related lines in a poem. And I point out the poem at the top of page 625 because it kind of shows us our rhyme scheme there. At the end of that verse, you can see we have sun, rages, done, wages, must, dust. So the reason why, if you look on page 625, there's this A, B, A, B, C, C. That's the rhyme scheme. That is the rhyme pattern. Because we have two A's, sun and done, two B's, rages and wages, and at the end we have must, dust. So some poets will try to organize, okay, how is my poem going to rhyme? What's my scheme? And they'll kind of use these letters to kind of show that pattern. But as we will find out, not all poetry rhymes. And some people like that, some people don't. And we'll talk about that. All right, 626. Meter, feet, and iambic feet. We won't talk about pentameter yet. That's going to be in part 2. But meter, feet, and iambic are three terms that kind of go hand in hand. Meter is just the regulated, free-flowing rhythm of ordinary speech. Whenever you go, I don't know if any of you have ever been to a slam poetry or a poetry slam, but if you go to a poetry slam, people will compete and read their poetry out loud. And you'll notice that it's not singing, it's not a song, but there is a certain rhythm when you read poetry that is trying to be captured by the poet. They're trying to create a sound through their language. And it varies from poet to poet, and we'll talk about that in a second. But meter is just that kind of regulated speech that almost sounds sing-songy in quality, but it's just their flow. When people talk about rappers, they talk about their flow. And, you know, rap is basically stands for rhythm and poetry. So, of course, it would make sense that that term is in there. A foot is usually in a line of poetry, and feet rather, are two-part segments that are, it's when a line is split into two parts back to back, like two, 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 like almost like footsteps. And then iambic is where in that foot, the second syllable is stressed. So I'm going to use on page 626 the example of Robert Frost's walking through the woods on a snowy evening. And that little verse that's towards the middle of the page there, I'm going to read this verse, and I want you to see if you notice something. So on 626, whose woods these are, I think I know. His house is in the village, though. He will not see me stopping here to watch his woods fill up with snow. Now, I'm just reading that and not putting a lot of inflection into it, but just the way it's written, do you realize that there's something happening in those words? That last line there especially, to watch his woods fill up with snow. It's like ba-bump, 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 ba-bump. It's almost like horse's footsteps, like hoof steps from a horse. And in the poem, Frost is riding a horse, and so it makes sense that when he wrote the poem, he wanted to create this like ba-bump, 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 ba-bump rhythm to it to make you, the reader, feel like you're almost riding alongside with him. And that's so neat. Frost is kind of a genius with poetry for that reason, because he just understood the emotions he wanted, even in a simple sentence like to watch the woods fill up with snow. I mean, that line's very simple. There's nothing revolutionary about it, but the way he writes it with just that little ba-bump, 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 it's neat. It makes you read it sort of in a certain way, and I find that fascinating. But iambic, so we have a meter, we have this ba-bump, 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 ba-bump rhythm, that's the meter. And if you look at that last line, in fact, all of his lines in this verse, if you look at to watch his woods fill up with snow. To watch is a foot, his woods is a foot, fill up is a foot, with snow is a foot. It's just two words back to back, two syllables. To watch his woods fill up with snow. Two syllables back to back to back. That is the idea of feet. Iambic is where the last syllable in each foot is stressed. So I say, to watch his woods fill up with snow. Watch, woods, up, and snow are all stressed when you say it, and that's iambic. That means that you put stress on that second syllable in each foot. So it's like ba-bump, ba-bump, ba-bump. That there's stress on that last line. It's just to create an effect, like a sound, to help kind of accentuate that. So you will notice down here my last bullet point, I talk about Nelly. I mentioned I grew up in the 90s, right? So I have this video that I want to show you all very quickly. Hold on. So this guy, he's called Todd in the Shadows, and he reviews music. We're not going to talk about him very much at all because I usually use him more in English 121 as an example. But he does a lot with music and kind of reviews songs and how they're written and how they're described and how the poetry works and things like that. And he's really funny. He has a very, very, very dry sense of humor. But in this very short segment that I'm going to show you, he explains kind of Nelly's flow. And he's talking in context of Florida Georgia Line's Cruise song. He's not a fan. Spoilers. So he's trying to compare why Nelly would have collaborated with this music group. So we're just going to watch a very short segment of this video, and if you want to watch more of it, you can look it up on your own time. But we're going to watch this short segment real quick.
So, cars and hoes.
That's a bad place to start.
Why did it take these two genres so long to get together? Now, being of the newer American Eagle-wearing breed of country singers, Florida Georgia Line are openly fans of hip-hop. They even have one of their songs spell "it's" with a Z. That's still cool, right? Was it ever? But anyway, the remix was actually Nelly's idea.
Yo, I was checking out the Cruise video, man. Hey, that thing the deal, boy. I think we need to turn it up, though. What you think?
Both Florida and Georgia there say they were super psyched about it because they've been listening to Nelly since they were kids. Because, holy crap, Country Grammar came out 13 years ago and they would have been in middle school. And Nelly is almost 40. And I found a gray hair in the mirror the other day. And anyway, why did Nelly pick this song to guest on? Well, like I said, the subject matter fits, but also, have you ever listened to Nelly's flow? That sing-songy thing he does?
1, 2, 1, 2.
Yeah, if you listen, it's just two notes. Two notes, a fourth apart, like this. Da 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 da. This chicken, she just blew right up the block for me, and she got the hots for me, the finest thing I had to see. And Cruise? When I first saw that bikini top on her, she's popping right out of the South Georgia water. Da 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 da. Two notes, perfect for Nelly.
So yeah, So yeah, that example with Nelly, that same like da 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 da. He's stressing the last syllable, making it iambic. So when I think of meter and I think of iambic and feet together, I usually think of Nelly because his rap style is very much that bump 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 bump. And I know Todd in that video adds the extra, the extra note in there too, but that's basically the idea. Alright, so I just want to show you guys that example. Alright, these other terms that we have that kind of continue along, we have half and slant rhymes, and I actually find myself seeing this more and more with music nowadays, is that we aren't necessarily rhyming specific words over and over again as much as we are using half and slant rhymes, which are words that don't rhyme but sound similar. So, I think of, you can go look it up, I'm not going to play Miley Cyrus for you, but Party in the USA, there's not a lot of rhyming going on in that song, but there's lots of half rhymes and slant rhymes. So you just go look that song up and you'll see what I mean. There's words that sound like they should rhyme, but they don't. Alright, and then we get to free verse versus open form. This is kind of the big debate in the poetry world of open form and free verse. Are they poetry? Are they not poetry? Well, the difference between the two, and I know that my video kind of cuts off part of this, is free verse has no rules. You don't have to rhyme. It doesn't have to be in a verse. It doesn't have to record. It doesn't have to look like a poem, basically. It only resembles a poem in terms of that it's describing abstract, basic emotions and a snapshot in time. It doesn't have a story. It's just kind of this vignette of a moment. That's really all it has to do with poetry. And a lot of people that are poetry purists aren't really for free verse. They're like, it's not poetry, it's just kind of haphazard fiction writing. So take that for what you will. I do think free verse is still poetry, but it's kind of, you guys will see some examples this unit of free verse, and I'll kind of leave it all up to you guys what you think it is, whether it's poetry or not so much. Open form, though, is poetry. I think that most people that study poetry will agree open form is poetry. It looks like a poem. There are still verses, there are still lines, but it doesn't have to rhyme, and it doesn't have to have a pattern. It just still does everything poetry does except have a rhyme or a pattern, which I know seems like some of the essentials that poetry has, but I mean, I think open form's been more accepted in modern day literature than free verse, but we shall see. All right, so our textbook asks us how we interact and read poetry, and they give us some suggestions on when we read poetry what we should do. And basically these 5 things are our tips. So first, they say give the poem a close reading. What makes poetry harder than fiction is that you kind of have to study it. You've got to read the poem more than once and figure out what the author is trying to say. So that requires a quote-unquote close reading. 2, you have to get your bearings. You need to look at the author, study the poet, see what their background is, and that will give hints as to what kind of poetry they're writing and why. Respond to the poem as a whole. It can be very easy for us as readers to read the opening verse of a poem and go, ah, it's lame, I don't like it. Or get to the end and go, well, why'd they do that? That was weird, I don't like it. But the idea is that you have to look at the poem as a whole. What's the whole point of the poem? And sometimes with poets, they create what are called chapbooks, which are their books of poetry, multiple poems all wrapped up together. And sometimes you have to look at the whole chapbook as a whole. Rachel McKibbins, who is one of my favorite poets, she writes a lot about her childhood and how very traumatic and the things that she kind of dealt with and went through. And it's very dark, it's very real, but a lot of her poems by themselves don't make a lot of sense. But then when you read the whole book, you're like, oh, okay, this is her childhood and her going through life and becoming a mother and kind of how her past experiences have influenced her own parenting. And until you read the poem book as a whole, the individual poems may not seem as strong, but together they kind of create this really powerful message. And so that would be, responding to it as a whole. And then I'm getting into the spirit of the poem. Once you understand what the message of the poem is, I think it becomes easier to read it and understand what the poet is trying to get across. So with McKibbins again, once you realize what her message is, you can go, okay, now I can read this a second time and have a whole new meaning to it because I get what the point of this poem is. And then be ready for a personal response. Many poets write to elicit a raw emotional reaction from their readers. And that can kind of throw people off guard too, because they can think, oh, well, I don't feel comfortable reading this. And for some poets, that's their goal. They want you to feel emotional and to question things. And so you have to kind of be ready when you read poetry sometimes to have this emotional reaction and kind of think, oh, well, how does this affect me and why? And that's not always the case. There are tons, as you will see in this lovely textbook, nature poetry about leaves, that are not necessarily listing a raw emotional response other than wonderment or excitement about seasons. But in some cases, yeah, poems are meant to be deep, quote unquote. Our textbook talks about, in this chapter finishing off, the difference between vignettes and haikus. And I will tell you all that I had a student several semesters ago that I got so cracked up by because he hated haikus. Absolutely hated them. To the point that when I asked, and I will for you all too, when I asked him to write a haiku on his final exam, his haiku was about how much he hated haikus and hated that I'd made him do one. So I'll apologize ahead of time. But on page 643, they talk about haikus and vignettes. Haikus are very, very rigid in terms of their structure. They have very specific rules. And that's why I like them, because I think they're a challenge. Because there are only 3 lines of poetry, just 3 lines. Each line has to have a certain number of syllables. So the syllable requirements are 5, 7, 5, meaning line 1 has to have 5 syllables, line 2 has 7, and line 3 has 5 again. So I've given you guys this example haiku that I kind of made on the fly. Class is almost done. Sorry, how was it over? Class is almost done. Can you hear spring calling now? Wish class was over. That's a haiku. I will ask you on your exam to create a haiku. It has to be only 3 lines, and it has to be 5-syllable line, 7-syllable line, 5-syllable line. If you break those requirements, then I won't give you full credit for that question. So just keep that in mind. The other term here is what's called a vignette, which is just a snapshot poem. It is also just 3 lines, but there is no rhyme scheme, no requirements on syllables. It's pretty much free form, aside from it has to be only 3 lines. So those are the differences between those two very short poems. I think they're fun. I don't know. I kind of like the challenge of creating haikus, and I think the minimalism of vignettes can be fun too, because you don't feel like you have to strain yourself to write this big, long, epic poem, but at the same time, you've got to choose your words carefully. I mean, this haiku that I made here, I made in like a minute, and it's not very good. But people that make really good haikus have to just pick out the perfect word and figure out the perfect word to describe so many things in a short, span. So I think they're fun. I've had students that love them and one particular student that hated them, but, hopefully you give them a try and have fun with them. All right, chapter 13 is pattern, and it starts on page 650. And we get some terms right off the bat. We get one term, which is context, which talks about a web of meanings. Like I said, poetry is meant to be complex. It's supposed to have a lot of different things going on at once. It's usually short, but full of different meanings, and in this case, contexts. Poems do different things too. Sometimes they ask questions and work out the answers. Sometimes they play off of what we call polarities, which are opposites, comparisons. They compare one thing to the other and how they're similar and different and why. They can play off contrasting points of view. A poem can start off with one person's point of view and end with another. And poems can even be like stories. They can build to a climax or a high point and then have closure. So poems can do a lot of different things, but they are typically shorter and more concise and direct than a fiction story is. All right, I know I'm throwing a lot of terms at you guys on this slide, so bear with me. We've talked about in our fiction chapter abstract versus concrete. And concrete poetry does exist. Poetry is not just abstract stuff. They talk about physical, tangible things a lot. Robert Frost, as I noted, he talks a lot about physical, tangible things in reality and describes nature and kind of its beauty and etc., etc. Poems also can use repetition and parallelism. Repetition is when they repeat certain styles or words in a poem. Sufjan Stevens, he is a singer-songwriter. He likes to use repetition a lot in his, I call it poetry even though it's songwriting because his songs are very poetic. But he uses repetition a lot. The Police, if you ever listen to the band The Police, they use repetition a lot to create different meanings in their songs. I think of Message in a Bottle. They use a lot of repetition in that song. And then parallelism is when your poem starts and ends in a certain way or with similar text. And it's to try to create this, coming full circle effect in the poem. So those are those terms. Cumulative and counterpoint I kind of set off by themselves because they're kind of two sides of the same coin. So if your poem is cumulative, it builds to a certain point. It just kind of has this climax it's reaching towards, and that's what each verse kind of builds to. Counterpoint, though, doesn't do that. Counterpoint does kind of a pinball effect where it just goes back and forth from point to point. And it doesn't necessarily build to any specific thing. It just wants to compare this versus that versus this versus that. So if you listen to some songs on the radio, some of them build to a point and some of them don't. Garth Brooks's The Thunder Rolls, for example, is a cumulative song. Its verses build to a specific point. It's a very story-like song, and it has a climax and it has a resolution. Whereas Taylor Swift's song, for example, You Belong to Me, does she's cheer captain and I'm on the bleachers. It's point to point to point to point. It doesn't really build to anything. It's just comparing herself to this other girl. And that's a counterpoint poem. It doesn't really have to build to anything. So, and there's a lot of songs you guys can find to compare and say similarly, but that's kind of what those two styles are. Antithesis is taking a certain theme and building a poem whose purpose is the direct opposite of it. So if your poem starts out talking about war, for example, and ends talking about how destructive it is, that's kind of an antithesis, where your poem's all about the antithesis of war. You start talking about it, but then the whole point is that you're against it. That'd be one example. And then metaphysical is when, metaphysical is when you are passionate and analyze emotions and rationalize them. It's the opposite of concrete poetry. It is when a metaphysical poem is all about abstract ideas and kind of talking about emotions and what they mean. All right, so chapter 14 and 15. I know these slides are filled with text, and I apologize ahead of time. If you'll notice in your textbook, chapter 14 has no terms. It's all about imagery, which is fine, but I want to touch base on it because it starts on page 683. I mean, the only term they have is what an image is, which is pretty self-explanatory. It's just talking about the senses in poetry. And on page 698, you guys will probably notice in your textbook this series of glossy picture poems. And I really like this section of our textbook, that they combine these pictures and these poems. And these were chosen to go together. They weren't necessarily written or created at the same time, which I think is another thing that is cool. But you'll notice that the poems sometimes match really well with the pictures. Sometimes they don't. River Song, I think, matches well with the picture. Girl Powdering Her Neck matches really well. On Bananas and Grapefruit number 3, that poem usually gets people kind of like, what's going on? That poem matches perfectly with its picture. But some, like Vermeer and Classic Scene, for example, don't maybe necessarily match so well. So, I don't know. But definitely look at those. I have a lot of students that like Organization as their poem of choice because they say it describes their life. So I don't know. I think they're very fun poems. I enjoy looking at the images and poems together. But that's chapter 14 on image. So we're going to skip ahead then to chapter 15, which is metaphor versus simile again in the way of metaphor. I was about to skip ahead to chapter 16. So metaphor we talked about is comparing two things without using like or as. Simile is where you use like or as. So one thing that this chapter talks about is being careful of cliches. You don't want to be too oversimplified, or you don't want to use something that's commonly used in a poem. So, you know, like love is like chocolates or something weird like that. You don't want to be cliche, because poetry is one of those things where we see it so much, and poets oftentimes use the same phrases over and over again that readers get really bored of it. So an extended metaphor, like we talked about earlier, is just repeated throughout the poem. However, a controlling metaphor is when that extended metaphor becomes the central theme of the poem, driving it. So for example, if the color red symbolizes something in the poem and keeps being compared to something over and over again, and it becomes kind of the central theme of it, then it becomes a controlled metaphor. So I think oftentimes of in fairy tales, Red Riding Hood, her red cape kind of becomes a symbolic item, and it almost sort of controls the story in a way. That would be a controlling metaphor. But figurative language is the term right after that. When we tell someone we know, we're like, oh, figuratively speaking, or figuratively. We're not being real. We're just comparing something to something that isn't there. Figurative means it's not there. Literal means it's real. Figurative means it's not real. So figurative language in poetry is just a comparison with something that's not really there. Our other two terms in this chapter are sonnets and conceits. I think everybody that has heard of poetry has at least heard of the term sonnet, even if you don't know what it means. Sonnet is just a structure. It is a specific 14-line structure of a poem. And you may think to yourself, 14 lines, that seems like a lot. It is. And William Shakespeare is probably one of the most famous sonnet writers. He not only wrote plays, he also wrote a lot of poetry, and he liked sonnets quite a bit. I know I've had some students in high school that when they took my class, they said that in high school they had to write sonnets, and I feel your pain because it's hard. But that is what a sonnet is. And a conceit is an elaborately developed setup analogy or comparing story within a poem. And again, Shakespeare wrote a lot of sonnets and several conceits as well. And that's this presentation part 1. So chapters 12 through 15. Like I said, there are a lot of examples in these chapters. So please feel free in our discussion forums and as you're studying, go to the example poems that they give us and look them over. Read one once or twice and kind of see if you can pick out some of the terminology that we've just gone over. But otherwise, please feel free to go to part 2 and watch as I kind of go over the rest of our poetry unit. All right, see you guys.